And hello, everybody. I think I know most folks. I'm Pauline Hoffman. I'm the statewide communication director, and I'm also a professor in the School of Communication at St. Bonaventure. And one of the things I said at the outset was that I think it'd be really nice if we had someone come and talk to us about how do you communicate with the media? What does that mean? We shouldn't fear the media, contrary to what previous administrations thought. They are not the enemy of the people. And Rich Lee was the first person I thought of. He's been a colleague of mine for several years. And he has worked in every area of communication, I think, except perhaps advertising, right? But he started out, and correct me, Rich, if I get any of this wrong, but to up your street cred, you were a rock critic too. I think you were a music critic. Not that you need street cred, but also he has worked in the news media and is currently doing that now. He and his wife run our Tap Into, which is a franchise chapter that the students write. It's essentially an online newspaper, and they've done a lot within our local area to compete with our local media. And it actually has aggravated and kind of made some of our local media folks mad, but they're doing a really good job with that. But he also has worked in PR, and he's also worked as a press secretary for a former governor in New Jersey. And the reason I mentioned that is because when I connected with Rich earlier this week, I said last week we had, or a couple of weeks ago, we had a couple colleagues talking to us about how to deal with legislators and how do we reach out to government folks. So if there's a way to marry a conversation about the media as well as with the government, that might be, a really nice angle. So how we want to do tonight, though, is Rich is going to talk for a little bit about different interactions with the media. I have some questions I can ask him, but we really would love more questions from you guys. I'm monitoring the chat, so if you want to put questions in the chat, or if you even want to just say, I have a question and you want to actually ask it, I'm fine with that too. But I have the chat open so I can monitor that, but I'm going to pause. And I'm going to turn it over to Rich to kind of take things over and tell us a little bit more about himself, and then to go into some of the information that he has for us.
Okay, thanks, Pauline, and thanks, Sally, and everyone else for having me here. And Pauline, you got the introduction right. I have no corrections. I appreciate that. And you even said something which I was going to add myself about TAP. And I think it's an important point that, yeah, Pauline's right. I do have a diverse background, going from rock music critic to political reporter to working for, governors, but it's not all something that's in the past tense. My wife and I do run this online news site. So we're practicing journalism today, and we even occasionally go out and cover stories ourselves. And on the other side of the business, the PR side, I run a public policy institute called the Jandoli Institute. And I'm conscious of using my public relations skills to promote the things that we do at the Institute. So I'm still, the business has changed. It's changed in some ways, and some of the basics still are the same, but I'm still practicing public relations, practicing, journalism today. So what I thought I would do is, as Pauline said, I don't want to talk for a long time. I'm just going to share a couple of ideas that I put together that I think would be helpful. And I think, as Pauline said, maybe it's a follow-up on what you did with your previous speaker. Don't be afraid of journalists. They're pretty much regular people like the rest of us, which means some of them are going to be good. They're going to be good to work with. Some of them are just going to be jerks. It's just the same way it would be in any field. Don't form your image of journalists by people you see on cable television screaming at each other. That's part of journalism, but, I would say it's a high profile part, but the nuts and bolts journalists that you're going to work with, for the most part, aren't like that. So let me share the screen, just go through a couple of slides here. And this first one has a lot of type on it, which I don't generally do, but I think it kind of sets the tone, and I'm going to reinforce a lot of these points as I talk. Main thing, first point, reporters and editors have always been busy, but today they're busier than ever. And that's because when I was a reporter, I went out and I covered a story, I came back and I wrote it, and that was it. If you're a reporter today, you have to write a story, you have to shoot video, you have to blog, you have to tweet, and you have to do it almost immediately. and there's less reporters, less journalists than ever because of what's happened economically in the industry. So they're bombarded with press releases, with pitches for stories. Most of them are not used just because of the volume. So there's a couple things you can do to increase the odds that your press release or your event gets covered. And I'm going to go through, give you some examples of most of these. First, it sounds simple, have news. When I switched from being a journalist, when I had my first public relations job, I was shocked by how little people understood how the news business worked. Even, powerful, my first public relations job was in the state assembly. The assembly speaker, he just couldn't understand why certain things were not being covered. So you have to have a good sense of how the business operates and what reporters consider news, and what they consider news basically is what the public considers news, because they're a business. They're going to write stories, post stories, whatever. They're going to choose the stories that people are going to read, that they're going to view online. Write well, whatever you do, proper grammar, punctuation, and style. It all comes down to that last bullet. The easier you make it for a journalist to use a press release to cover your event, the more likely that's going to happen. So I always tell people with press releases, write it like a news story. The less work somebody has to do to turn that into a news story, again, the greater your odds. And be accurate, which kind of goes without saying, but what's going to happen if you send a reporter incorrect information in a news release and that gets printed, the person who's going to get blamed is that news organization, that reporter, not you. So the next time you send something out, they're going to think twice before they use it. So let me start out with what news is. And if you Google what makes news, you're going to find a lot of things. This is a slide that we have from the organization, the Tap Into organization, which oversees our local website. And it's a pretty good description of what makes news. First couple, I would imagine, are not really going to apply to your organization, but you should be aware, impact consequences. The greater impact it has on people's lives, the more likely it is to get covered. Conflict is always news. I'm not going to say go sit in your college president's office to demand more pay, but that would get more coverage than sending out a letter or a press release. Loss of life, property destruction. As much as people say they hate to see, a story where somebody's gone through a tragedy, people watch them. But the next couple are things that I think you may be able to take advantage of with your organization. Proximity. Everybody's college is in a community. You're a member of that community. So if you do something, the local media should have an interest in it, okay? And don't just think of the community that your college is in. Everybody has a hometown. If you do something and you think it's newsworthy, or you have something to say about something that's in the news, try to get it to, wherever you're from, or maybe even the place where you got your degrees, because schools love to, tout their alumni. But I'll give you an example of the use of hometowns. There is a man who works in the film industry in California. He was born in Olean. He just wrote a book. His publicist contacted us and asked if we wanted to do it. So we had a reporter talk with him. She did a nice feature story on him. He probably hasn't lived in Olean in years, but it was a nice story about growing up in Olean and how it might have connected to his book. So again, if there's a way to connect what you're doing, not just to the town that you're working in, but to where you're from, do that. Prominence will get you coverage. Celebrities, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a megastar. If you do an event with the mayor, that might draw more people than if it's just you and your colleagues, or athletes. Obviously, are big. That's people will come and cover that. It's probably you want them to cover what you're doing, but it's going to be the celebrity, the glitz that is going to get them out there. Timeliness is a good way to work yourself in the news, and I'm going to hold off on that for a few minutes because I have some examples of how you can use timeliness to get events and people covered. And the last one is novelty, which it's the oldest cliche in the book, but it's true. Dog bites man is not a story. Man bites dog is a story. It's, it was true whatever many years ago, somebody said it, and it's still true today. News is the unusual. Okay? That's why a lot of times I'll hear, how come the press only writes bad stories? And the truth is, if you get up, you don't go to work, whether you're a police officer or a politician, you do your job the right way, the way you're supposed to be doing, it's not news. You do something wrong and it becomes news. I'm going to give you an example of how you can make things easier for reporters. And one way is, if you have a good story, don't hide it. Get it out there. Don't make an editor have to work for it. Because if an editor is getting, dozens of press releases, he or she's probably going to read the first couple of lines and make a decision. This is what I'm going to use. This is what I'm not going to use. This is a news release we got, and most of these are examples from the Tap Integrator Olean site that Pauline mentioned in the introduction. It's about a fire in Olean. It's a pretty standard, release about a fire. It's not written terribly well, but in general, things you get from police and fire departments are not written by professionals. They read like police and fire reports. But looking at the story, it was a small house fire. It was extinguished fairly quickly, no injuries. It probably was going to be like maybe a 2-paragraph story or something like that. But if you read on to the second paragraph, read that.
Oh.
That's a better story. And I think a lot of people weren't going to read to that second paragraph, but how often do you find a 8 to 10 foot snake wandering around a house during a fire? So when we did the story, that was our headline: firefighters find 2 snakes. And our lead was city firefighters found more than a fire when they arrived at 413 Green Street. So, in this case, we picked up on it and I think we made it into a better story. But a lot of times that's not going to happen unless you put it up front. Again, make it as easy as possible. Don't make someone have to read through what is really a fire department report on a fire before you get to what the story is. This one even got some television coverage, and I Googled it when I use this as an example in another class, and I think there would have been a lot more coverage, had they played up the snakes right away. So anyway, if you have a good story, tell it, don't hide it. Next example I want to give you is from Siena College. They have a polling institute, and it gets a lot of coverage. Polls in general, reporters like them, so you're going to get a lot of stories on them, but they really make it easy for reporters to write about their polls, to talk about the people who do them. This is how they announced it. The poll came out on Tuesday. Monday afternoon, just a simple tweet: we're going to have a poll tomorrow on voters' views on Governor Cuomo and his handling of the pandemic. So if you're an editor, a day ahead of time this poll is coming out, so you can make plans for it. So you're not scrambling the next day to find someone to write about the poll. That's what we did at our site. We got one of our student reporters lined up. We said, this poll is coming out tomorrow. We want you to write about it. So we didn't have to, on Tuesday morning, see who's in class, who's available, who can do this. Now there's a link in there, and I'm going to show you what happens when you click on that link. Because again, this is all about making it easier for reporters. Okay. This is their advisory. I'm going to just blow up this part here. So if you read the advisory, it gives you a little more details about what's going to be in the poll, but it doesn't really give you the story. One of the things about advisories, you want to give the press enough information to whet their appetite, to tell them there's a good story there to cover, but you don't want to give them all the details, because then they'll write the story before your official announcement. So that's there. But I want you to look at the last paragraph. It's going to be emailed tomorrow morning at 5:30 a.m. So 5:30 a.m. sounds like an ungodly hour to do news. But if you're an AM radio station, or you're doing a morning talk show, if you're one of the TV stations, how much fresh news is there at 5:30 in the morning? You're guaranteed you're going to lead a lot of those reports because your poll is out there at 5:30. So on the day before, reporters not only know that there's going to be this poll, they know it's going to be out early in the morning. Not everybody's going to wake up at 5:30 to look at it. But again, if you're the producer of a morning television show, there's something you can have that's brand new, breaking news in the morning. This was on a webpage when you click that link, and I want to show you as you scroll down the rest of it. And then you see the logo from the Institute, so there's some good branding there. But the contact information up front, it tells you exactly how you can get a hold of the pollster. Starting at 8 a.m., you can get him on phone, you can get him on Zoom or Skype. Here's his email, here's his cell number, make arrangements, and he's there to answer your questions. And sure enough, he was. We wanted to have kind of a different angle with our story. We wanted to see how the views of Cuomo upstate, compared with the views downstate. So she asked him that question, got a good quote. He pulled out he broke down the statistics a little bit more than were in the release. So Sienna made this guy they do this routinely, and I think they do it really well. When I was a State House reporter in New Jersey, there was a political scientist at Rider named David Rebovich, and he was quoted, must have been more than 100 political science professors in New Jersey. He was probably quoted 90% of the time over other ones. And it was because if there was a press conference at the State House, he would be there. He'd stick around and he'd chat with reporters. Then he'd walk up and down what was called press row, all the offices where reporters where the news organizations had their bureaus. He'd just pop his head in, say hello, you're doing a story on a press conference, you want to talk about it. And he was very quotable. And back to what I said at the beginning, reporters have always been busy. If somebody's there in your office, willing to give you a quote, an analysis of what happened, you're going to take that. You don't have to look up who's our political science professors in New Jersey, who has some expertise in this area. So you have to be, being proactive helps to an extent. You don't want to be an annoyance, but you kind of walk that fine line. I want to talk a bit about timeliness was one of the items on there. This is my Outlook calendar, which I didn't put on so you can see when I have classes, when I have meetings, when I have doctor's appointments, but I do something usually late December, early January. I try to anticipate what's going to be in the news. And obviously the news changes, there's things that happen that you can't predict, but to a certain extent, there's things that you can maybe build an event around or work yourself into something to get some publicity. And here's a couple things from February. When I was putting this, and I looked to see what happened maybe 5-10 years ago, there might be anniversaries of things. And 5 years ago, Ted Cruz won the Iowa caucuses. So I made a note of it back in December. Didn't really think too much about it because I don't remember a whole lot about the Iowa caucuses from 2016. But when this popped up as a reminder, my calendar, I did it, I Googled the 2016 Iowa caucuses. And the interesting thing was Donald Trump finished second. And his reaction was there was voter fraud and that the results were bogus. It almost was exactly what he said after the Biden election. So I turned it into a blog post for the Giandoli Institute. It was timely, it was kind of funny. February 10th, Carole King's Tapestry album was released 50 years ago. We have a new award in our communication school. It's called the Tapestry Award. We haven't announced it, but I suggested to the dean, if you're looking for a good tie-in, why don't you announce it on February 10th? A lot of people are going to be writing about this iconic Carole King album. So he either didn't like my idea or, the award wasn't ready to be announced. I think it's the latter, but those are the types of things they're good to look for. February 23rd was supposed to be the State of the Union address. I think they're actually moving it back now, but that's something I could help promote my Public Policy Institute, maybe tell reporters ahead of time, if you need a comment about the State of the Union, you want someone to analyze it who's worked in government, who's worked in politics. So, and obviously the State of the Union is going to get a lot of coverage. We're doing an event for the Giandoli Institute about speeches. We're trying to keep it nonpartisan. We're going to have a bunch of people who've either given speeches, written speeches, talk about what makes a good speech. So we're going to do that when it was scheduled for the 23rd, which was a Tuesday, we were going to do it on Monday. So because I made these little notes that the State of the Union was going to be on the 23rd, that would be a way to get some publicity for the Giandoli Institute. There's a new Billie Holiday movie coming out February 26th. I don't know a whole lot about it, but think of your organization. If you teach filmmaking, if you teach music or maybe African American studies, that's a way to maybe work what you do into the news or to write something, write an op-ed article or talk to your local film critic. You're going to be writing about this new movie. I have some thoughts on it that I thought your readers might like to know. February 29th, five years ago, Spotlight won the Best Picture. For those of us who teach journalism, it's a good way to maybe talk about the importance of journalism and remind people about this movie. So that's, kind of a way to work timeliness. And when I worked in the governor's office, every Labor Day, I try to get our labor commissioner to do an op-ed article on the importance of labor. Around Earth Day, we'd get the DEP commissioner to do an event, or if there were some environmental initiatives that we had been sitting on and waiting for a good time to announce them, that was when you do it. So, like I said, the news is unpredictable, but to a certain extent, you can guess what people are going to be writing about at certain times. Last point I wanted to make has to do with building relationships, which is true in any field. So, try to, not necessarily, it's tough today, but, meet reporters, get to know reporters. Don't be afraid if you see an article, send an email that, you like the article, or maybe ask a question or something like that. A few months ago, the New York Times did a story about college journalists and what they were doing during the pandemic. And the point of the story was that college journalists were really providing an important service through their coverage of the pandemic. I read the story, it was a really good story. I sent the reporter an email, saying I liked the story, and said, by the way, my wife and I run this online news site with students, they've been doing, I gave a couple of examples, A, B, and C. If you revisit the topic, think about contacting us. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, she did another story, and we got our reporter, our organization, into the New York Times. So, some of this isn't rocket science, it's just people skills. But as I said at the beginning, just keep in mind, journalists are people, get to know them, build relationships, and it'll, I think, go a long way towards getting you coverage for your own work, for your organization, for anything that you're involved with. So that is, pretty much the points I put together, and look forward to what sort of questions you may have.
Thanks so much, Rich. That's fabulous. I have a handful of questions that I can ask too, but if there are folks who have questions, I don't see any in the chat. Duran, okay, have at it. Go ahead.
I guess just got a comment. I'm glad, Rich, for what you said about leading with the important stuff first. I've read newspapers and famous ones, and I don't know why, but they always start, Johnny Jones was sitting in his house looking at the river, and they set up this story like it's a novel, and I'm saying, what is going on in the article? I just wish they'd say, a fire happened and a couple of snakes were saved. They don't always get to the point in the mainline newspapers, and I wonder why they don't do that.
Well, some of it would be the nature of the story if it's a more featurey type story, but some of it also has to do, I think, with social media, in that we don't often learn about something first from reading a news article. Usually people have read about it online, or there's been Facebook posts, or it's been tweeted about. So the story is almost like a second day story, so they're not writing about the fire, they're writing about the reaction to the fire or something like that. That would be, my explanation. With breaking news stories, we teach our students to do what traditionally has been done, your who, what, when, where, why, and how in your lead.
If I can follow up, to use a phrase, usually the type of story I'm looking at is when they say something like student loan forgiveness programs are being cut, and I want to learn about that. Or faculty classroom resource budgets are being cut. And they start with a long, long story. And I'm saying, I want to know the facts. What's going on? What's happening? Who's doing the cutting? How much is being cut? Who's going to be affected? And I've just found that a lot of news reporters don't do that. And I wish they would.
Yeah, I mean, again, with those sort of stories, we try to tell students, put the information up front. Mm-hmm. And, I've had that frustration too. You see a headline and there's information in here that I want to learn, and you have to work to find it.
Yeah.
And I'm actually glad you brought that up, because that's something for all of us to remember too. Think about how frustrated we all get if we don't get the information that we want immediately. So when we're, if each of us with our own chapters or organizations, if you're reaching out to the media, don't think you're building this big dramatic story. You need to get to the point right away. Otherwise it's going to be lost. So I think that's certainly something to remember. Does anyone else have a question right now? Or I don't see hands. Or Rich, could you talk to, I know you've spoken about the relationship building, which is a key component. And I know a lot of us are at universities that might be in smaller cities or smaller towns where we might be able to do that in a better way than say like, a Manhattan or something, although, certainly we can still do that there. And you gave us some ideas about how to reach out to the media. Can you talk also about what we would say to them? So like, for example, if the media calls me up and they want to talk to me about a particular issue because I've sent the release, can you kind of give us some tips and things? Because I know when I've interviewed people myself, if they talk too long or if they don't speak in sound bites, so to speak, I kind of lose it. And I think, oh my gosh, I can't put you on the air, or I can't put you in this article because I can't condense what you've said. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good point. Going back to even pitching a story, you need to be able to explain it in a sentence or two. If it takes longer than that, you're probably going to lose people. But in terms of talking with the media, I'm a big believer in talking points. Have 2 or 3 points that you want to make in your interview and try to bring them into every answer. It's sometimes frustrating for a reporter, but I mean, if those are the points you want to make, have them in front of you. I mean, if you're sending out a release, anticipate that you're going to get somebody to call about it, and have those points in there that you want to make. If you watch any of the Sunday news talk shows, and that's where I said some of the frustrations come in, you'll see reporters interviewing politicians and they're trying to get an answer, and the politician will start out might have maybe vaguely mentioning the question and then go into his or her talking points. And that's, I mean, I worked on that side of the business. That's how we would train people. The answer was, no matter what the question is, you're going to say A, B, C.
Okay. Can you also talk about, I know that you and Anne, your wife, work with the student media. I mean, you're certainly in a more professional role than that because some student media is run by the students. Can you talk about the role of the student media too? Like, should we be courting our own student media, and how do we do that?
You mean quoting it or working with it or
working with them? Like how can we, I mean, I imagine it's the same sort of thing, but how is it different at all? Or no, do you not think so in terms of reaching out to your student media on your own campuses?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I'm a big believer in treating student journalists like real journalists. And, we're fortunate that the people who our students work with treat them that way. Like our local congressman, Tom Reed does a media call once a week. And once we started up, they invited our students there, and they're on the phone with the Wall Street Journal, Buffalo News, asking questions like that. And keep in mind the audience you want to reach. I mean, if it's important for you to reach your campus audience, and it probably is, you want to be in your campus media. One of the things that I learned, which was kind of interesting when I switched from journalism into public relations, as a journalist, you always want to work for bigger, more prestigious news organizations. But I learned that people read the small little shoppers and things like that too. So getting a photo in something like that is going to get you exposure with people in your area. And that's a lot easier to do than to get into the New York Times or Wall Street Journal.
And Cheryl, I'm sorry, I'm looking in the chat and I see your hands up, so sorry about that.
That's okay. I just sent it in the chat. It's a couple of statements. Our college actually tried to pass a media policy where we were not allowed to talk to or contact the media unless we first passed the material on to the administrators for approval for us to talk to the media. And if we did not do that, there would be serious repercussions. Fortunately, we fought it. The AAUP, of course, was really great and pointing out, the unconstitutionality of it all. But it was really, really shocking that they wanted us to not be able to reach out to the media in any way. Also, when you guys were talking about the condensing of the information in the first paragraph, my mother is a retired librarian, and the library sciences have gotten to be a strong major again, because library science majors are hired to condense the information that we see online, because they are really skilled at that. So I was so happy to tell my mother that, who felt that the library sciences were, suffering. And I also really enjoyed what you said about the reporters, and reaching out to your favorite reporters, and sending them an email if you like an article, so that you could set up a rapport. I think that is really, really excellent advice. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Those are all interesting points, especially the one about library science. But I want to go back to your first one on the policy. I think we all agree it's an awful policy, but we're seeing more and more policies like that, not necessarily on college campuses, but big organizations. They want to control the message. They don't want their employees.
Right, exactly.
And we had an incident maybe maybe a little over a year ago, where someone did a story. They interviewed someone at our local hospital and I don't know the original arrangements, but I think she called and the story got posted. And then we were contacted by the administrator of the hospital, saying this person wasn't supposed to talk with you. How did this happen? And our response was, it was a reporter doing her job. But we kind of sensed that, unfortunately, this person who was kind enough to talk to the reporter and share some, pretty important information. I think it was when the pandemic was just starting, probably was going to get into some sort of trouble at the hospital. So, as I said, in the private sector, a lot of corporations do that. I think we have a stronger, way to push back as college professors, to talk about, freedom of speech. But it's not, unfortunately, what you described, is not surprising.
Wow, I am so sorry to hear that. I'm just really sorry, because how do you get the truth? Do you have the person in the shadows with a voice box, and not mention their names? I mean,
yeah, well, a good reporter is gonna have sources and find a way to work around those things. I mean, if there's information, if there's a story breaking and the people who have the information, who can tell that story, say don't have permission from their organization, if a reporter, if it's his or her beat, they should have contacts, and they'll generally find a way to report that story. But again, it's unfortunate that that person that's why a lot of times you see stories with anonymous sources, because somebody's not authorized to speak, but they have the information a reporter needs.
Now, Sally, I see your hand, but Leah had a question first, and hers is, what advice would you have to get the media's attention for an advocacy issue? Basically, how do you make news out of outrage?
Tie it to a specific event or activity. I mean, as important as whatever you're advocating for may be, just simply to advocate for it. Unfortunately, I don't think it would be considered news if there's a panel discussion, a speech. I'm a big believer in op-ed articles. I think for advocacy, that would be a good way to get started. And I made a note to just touch on them, which I didn't when I was talking, but op-ed articles are a way for you to get your message out pretty much in the way you want it worded. If you send out a press release, it may get used, it may not get used, part of it may get used. If you write an op-ed article and it gets published someplace, it's, other than maybe some minor editing, it's going to be written, it's going to say exactly what you wanted it to say.
Okay, Sally, and then Mary Rose, I see. So Sally, do you have your question?
I sort of a question and a comment, and it comes back to something you said earlier, Rich, on one of your first slides, that point 1 and point 2 and possibly point 3 wouldn't really apply to us. And I think it was around like harm caused, if my memory serves me correct. It was one of your earlier, I think it might have been your
Yeah, I
first
have it,
slide.
Jen. Go ahead.
And it was those first couple of points, and then it ties in with other things that have been said. My experience with the media, caused $1 million investigation of Binghamton University. My speaking to a reporter ended up in a nightmare of an experience there for a lot of people, myself included. So there were some concerns, and I'm asking you to speak to this about what we can speak of as faculty and what we can't speak of as faculty in terms of public speech. And I know that there's been, there are laws around this, and there are decisions around this. But I'm wondering what your information is around that. I know that speaking outside of our subject area, outside of our research area, free speech in the classroom, how does that translate to free speech with the press? I'm a firm believer, as most of you know enough of me, those that do, that, I speak the truth, and that's what it is. But that can get you in a lot of trouble. And what we don't want to see is our faculty compromise their safety and well-being. And then the second part of that is, I know when there's an active case, we have to be mindful of what's going on with an active case, so as not to put anything in the media that could compromise that investigation or that person's privacy. So I was wondering if you could maybe address a couple of those issues, please.
Sure. I mean, I'll take your second point first, which is probably an easier one. When you get a question, your answer basically is just, it's pending litigation. We can't talk about it at this time. The first one about free speech, I'm a big believer in free speech, and I think we're all entitled to talk about whatever we want to talk about, but we have to be aware of the consequences. I mean, if you're going to say something and it's going to affect one of your colleagues, just be aware of, think worst case scenario. And it was something else I was going to say. I just, lost my train of thought on that. But again, it'll hopefully come back to me. But, as far as I feel, say what you want to, what you feel you should say, but before you say it, think what's the worst possible thing that could happen if I say this, and and then make your decision if you really want to make that point or not.
Right. And just as at the point of follow-up of what you, I think, Pauline, was it you who said somebody said, sorry, I've missed who it was, that said you had to check in with your university first. You were given
Cheryl, I think Cheryl said that.
it was Cheryl, that you can't talk to anybody without going through the university. That came out afterwards. And we were basically told we were not anybody that contacted us from the press. It had to go through that appropriate office through the administration at the university. We weren't allowed to talk to anybody.
Okay, my point just came back to me, which was like, just be aware that when you're speaking, even if you're speaking as a private person, you're going to be connected with your employer. And people, even if you make it clear at the outset, I'm speaking as Rich Lee, I'm not speaking as a representative of St. Bonaventure, people know I'm a professor there, and they're going to make that connection. When I was at the governor's office, our labor commissioner got a DWI, and it would have been for anyone else 2 paragraphs in a police blotter. But because he was the labor commissioner, it blew up into a big story, and it was something he did on his own time. He wasn't driving drunk while at work or anything like that. So, but people do define you by where you work.
Ed, I see your question, but Mary Rose had her hand up first. So Mary Rose, will go to you, and then Ed, I'll read your question.
Yeah, and this is actually kind of ties in my question nicely with what Sally was saying, because I'm just sort of wondering how like you feel about this, and how most professional journalists would feel about this. But when I've done interviews with a student paper before, I've been misquoted, and it's I mean, I think it's just sort of, novice mistake. It wasn't anything. So the last time I gave an interview on when I was chair of the faculty senate, and it was a touchy subject. I was disagreeing with a decision the president of the university had said, and I felt that I had to say something. But I did make it. I said I need to see my quotes before that story runs. I need to see my quotes, and I was a little bit nervous about it, so I followed up and I saw them, and I was like, whoa, and I was like, and it wasn't even like I didn't say it. I'm like, no, I said that, but that can't run, like just the way it was framed, the way it sounded, and they were great, and they and of course I know the advisor, the faculty advisor, I was just like, it just might cause too much trouble, right? I mean, I'm not saying I didn't say that, but just the way it was pulled out of context, which reporters have to do, right? I mean, it's like, so I'm wondering, how, if I was going to talk to the Orlando Herald or the Buff News, I mean, can I ask to see my quotes, and would they likely or how careful do I have to be? And then that maybe gets back to the talking points. Maybe I don't want to just be so talking off the cuff.
I would say, to answer your question, one of the things that it's almost a cardinal rule in journalism, you never show a source your story. So I'm kind of surprised that happened. Of course, we're in a slightly different situation, but whenever you write a story, people you speak with, don't have a right to see it. That they need to trust you that you're going to get it right. That's you mentioned at the end, going back to your talking points. If you know this is what I want to say, keep saying it. You could, and I'll give you both sides of the industry, answer the questions by email. And as a journalist, we hate that because you can't follow up, you don't get body language or other nuances. But as someone who's going to be quoted, if you want to make sure your quote is accurate, answer the quote, put the quote in writing. But it's you got, in that case, you were able to see your quotes. But I would say in any professional news organization, they're not going to let you do that. As a reporter, sometimes
I think they just really needed my quote, because I think this reporter is having trouble getting anybody to go on the record about it. So I had a little more leverage.
Right. And then I've been in situations where, a reporter, might be a little not solid about what somebody said, and they might call back and said, I'm writing my story. I want to make sure I got this right. And on the other side, when I worked for the governor, more so when he was mayor, he would call reporters back and say, I want to make sure that you understood this. And, I mean, he might not put it like that, but again, that goes back to the relationships. You don't just give the interview. Maybe you call back an hour or two later. How's your story going? Do you need anything else? Was I clear?
Okay, Rich, Ed from Duval has a question. How do you handle the hierarchy within the media outlets? My understanding is the Buffalo News won't touch a story that was first broken by a smaller media site.
Yeah, my thought on that is there's so many different kinds of media. So if you're sending out a press release or you're trying to reach out, and if you throw it out to everyone, a smaller fish bites on it, then will the Buffalo News then ignore it, and then you really don't get out there? Or am I misunderstanding that?
No, I mean, there's competition. So if somebody has a story first, I think other news organizations, I don't know if it's real news, they won't ignore it, but it probably wouldn't get the same amount of play because it's not their story. They may look for a different angle so they can, move the story along. And if it's an important story, they'll find another angle. I'm thinking back to, like the Watergate days when the Washington Post and New York Times were trying to outdo each other. They weren't going to ignore the story because another paper broke it. They were just going to get a better story. But if it's a smaller thing, I don't know if the Buffalo News would necessarily not do the story, but I would still send it everywhere. I mean, depending on what it is and what your timing is. I'll give you an example with op-ed articles. The really large organizations like the New York Times, if you send something, if they're going to use it, I think they let you know in 3 business days, but they have exclusive rights. So if you want to get an op-ed in the New York Times, you don't send it to 20 different places, because if you're fortunate enough for the New York Times to say, yes, I want to use it, and the Buffalo News has already run it, then they're not going to do it. So with an op-ed, you know, you look at where you're sending it and maybe get it to the Times 3 days ahead of when it would still be timely. And then if they don't use it, then you can pitch it some other places. But op-eds are handled a bit differently than press releases.
Sally, you had another question?
I had another comment. I want to follow up with what Mary Rose said. I had it during the time at BU, I had an agreement with the New York Times, which they adhered to very, very carefully, that I got to see and review all quotes before they went in or they didn't get an interview. And they were very, very good about that. And the local paper, not at all. But the New York Times were actually really wonderful about letting me see all of my quotes and running them through ahead of time. So what I want to say is, I think, Rich, this speaks to what you were talking about developing a relationship with reporters. And I think, you know, for our organization, that's going to be really, really important, that we develop a relationship where it's symbiotic, right? We're going to be able to give them news, but we're going to make sure that we can trust, we can be trusted, they can be trusted. And that meant a lot. I mean, that meant a lot to me. And I think that there is possibilities of being able to work together in that way that can protect everybody.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's, you know, the point of building relationships. You know, we often tell students, you know, when you're assigned to a beat, make an appointment, sit down with the fire chief, with the mayor, so that the first time you speak with them is not in the middle of some disaster, so that they know who you are.
Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, yep, Duran.
I've got one last one. When it comes to the idea of quotes, I've been interviewed by people in our student body for their student newspaper, and I say it's okay if they have a little tape recorder. And some of them feel that they can get the quote more accurate if they've got a tape recorder than if they're just taking notes in shorthand the old-fashioned way. In terms of regular mainstream news outlets, is that something else that they do?
Yeah, I mean, today it's so easy to record things. So I would say most interviews are recorded. What we tell students to do is to do both, record the interview and take notes. First, should there be some problem with your recording, you have your notes. But if you're doing a half-an-hour interview with somebody and you're at deadline, you're not going to sit down and transcribe that whole interview. But if you take some notes, you know, maybe you say something that the student thinks is going to make a good quote, you write down at the 10-minute mark, and you can retrieve it, you know, better that way. Or maybe you write down what the quote, or as much of it as you can remember, then you go back to the recording and use it. But, you know, today, you know, since everybody has a recorder in their phone, I would say, you know, it's rare that an interview would be conducted that's not recorded.
Okay.
Well, and Rich, to one of the points that you made earlier too, you know, reporters aren't just actually writing the story. I mean, they might actually be using that quote, that audio for the blog or for the website or whatever too, right?
Yeah, I mean, and they may be, you know, opening up the camera on their phone and just shooting some video as well.
Rich, do you want to talk at all about off the record? I know that some folks, I don't know if you want to address that at all. If you recommend it, yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to relationship building for sure, but I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, I think we're kind of the conversation's heading in that direction. Well, the rule of thumb is that don't say anything off the record that you'd like to see in a newspaper or a website or whatever, because even if it's off the record, it somehow might find its way in. I'm going to say in print because I'm used to saying in print. And off the record is something that a reporter is not bound to honor your word. Most of them will, again, because they're trying to build relationships too. But should you say something that is a real bombshell, that they think is important to get out there, not just because it's shocking, but maybe it's really important news. It might find its way in there. And off the record, most news organizations have policies where if you're going to speak with someone and quote an anonymous source, it's not just done randomly. You have to speak with your editor. Your editor has to know who the person is. At the Washington Post, I have a friend who I used to work with, works there now, said that when they have an anonymous source, it has to be somebody who got that information firsthand, and it has to be confirmed by, I think, like 3 other people. So, but sometimes off the record, it's helpful to just give people background, help them understand why something's happening. I'll give you an example from when I was working for the governor. State trooper was killed in a traffic accident. It was obviously a sad story. The story was out on the wires, but his name wasn't there. And, people were writing stories. And what happened was the state head of state police called me in the governor's office and said, you need to hold off on this. He has an elderly aunt that they haven't been able to reach. We want to get to him. So the reporter from AP called, and again, it's about relationships. I knew the reporter pretty well. And he said, we need to get the story out. People know, people were at the scene. They saw the responding crew that the trooper died. And so I said, can I talk to you off the record? And I explained to him, here's what's happening, that as soon as his aunt is notified, we put his name out, and he understood. So, and fortunately it didn't take that long, and then the story got out. So, there's cases like that where you kind of, and it is a matter of trust, and it's a matter of relationships. I might not have been able to say that to a reporter maybe I was dealing with for the first time. So,
Sally, you have another question? No? Oh, okay.
I forgot
sorry.
to lower my hand. I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay.
It's this back and forth part here. I forgot to
Rich,
lower my hand.
along those same lines, what impact does the fact that everybody has a phone, everybody has the ability to record, everybody has a blog or Instagram or whatever it may be, so everybody's a journalist, right? I mean, clearly that's not true, but everybody's a journalist. What impact does that have on the business of journalism, if you will, or is that something that we as an organization should be paying attention to?
yeah, the impact is, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, that we're learning about news from people oftentimes who are not journalists, somebody who happens to be on the scene of an accident or, finds out something, puts it on Facebook or Twitter, and it's out there. So, the impact, that's why I oftentimes people complain to me, there's too much analysis, there's too much opinion in the news. And to a certain extent, that's true. But I think one of the reasons for it is because we're not picking up the newspaper to see who won last night's baseball game. We already know, what's going to be in the newspaper is going to be an analysis of why the manager made this decision or something like that. So I think that's been the real impact, that news is breaking or being broken by people who aren't journalists.
Well, thank you. I don't see other questions, and we're right at 7. So we can wrap things up. This, as we've mentioned, is going to be, has been recorded, so it'll be available on the website. If anyone has additional questions, absolutely reach out to Sally or to me, and we can make sure we get those questions answered. Thank you so much, Rich, for joining us. Thank you to
This has
everybody
been
who came
great.
today, Sally, for setting this up for us, and for your wonderful questions. I appreciate the questions. And again, thanks, Rich. I knew you'd do a fabulous job, and you certainly didn't disappoint. This was wonderful. So
Well, thanks. It was great being here. And I would just add, if people have questions further on, you can either, I'm pretty easy to find at St. Bonaventure, or just contact Pauline. Like if you get a phone call and you said, I'm going to be interviewed by this reporter and I don't know what to do, I'm happy to give some advice.
That's great. We really appreciate that. I just want to say thank you too. This was very informative, and I'm really glad to see so many people here. And as I said, this is being recorded, so it will be posted on the website as well. So you can share this with your chapter members and have it for future reference.
thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Sally.